Huh, that's great.
World War II came, and what happened, they closed down Grand Central, which was an aircraft company. They closed down all the aircraft industry that was working here and all of the jobs. And so the town went into a depression. The banks were folding up, and everything you could think of was getting really bad, and mortgages foreclosed in a large way. People took cars away from people. It was really bad. We had a major depression. It was as bad almost sure as it was in 29 and 30 when everything went, Hoover came about. I mean, Hoover got blamed for it, but he wasn't the reason. But anyway, Tucson died. It really died. It was looking for anything. So along came the Licavolis, and along came the whole mafia group come in here, and they were welcomed because they brought money, and they helped take over things. So Licavoli brought a man in from Detroit named Oakman. Mr. Oakman come into Tucson and showed the people in Tucson how to start milking the people. And they set up the planning and zoning. And the first three people that got appointed to planning and zoning, after they thought they could get away from the mafia, and there's Sam R. Kaufman, you remember him, and Pop Abbott, and Warren Shears. They became the zoning commission. Well, later they arrested them all and put them in jail, and they pardoned them and all that crap. But they set up the first planning and zoning. After that, they could control wherever anything was built, who was going to build, and who made money, and what realtors could sell property, and what ones that they could steal from the people, because they could zone it so they couldn't use it. So that was the town, and that's how that came in. Well, he worked in here in town for Ori Adler, and Ori was part of Bonnano people, and he came in here in town, and they were good people. Actually, they were a lot better than all the politicians I've ever met in my life. If one of these guys told you, well, Joe, we're going to kill you, well, you could count on being killed, you know? I mean, it's anything. But these politicians, if you get enough money, you can just about weasel anything you want weasel. But these people had a code of ethics, and I seen Bonnano's son just recently and had a long talk with him, and I sure hated. Yeah, his dad died, you know, and I went to the funeral when he was over there on the Catholic church that his wife had supported all those years in front of the university. And here they had all these cars and big towers and all this other stuff. And it was this hot summer day, and I walked in a white shirt and I had a tie on, and everybody was dressed in black suits. And I felt so out of place that I thought, well, I'd go out, but then Junior got up and got me and said, no, the old man would like you to stay. Back to Ernie here. Ernie come into town, and Ernie was an entertainer, a real good entertainer. And the town was really needing entertainment. I mean, the people were, it was a depressed state. Everybody was, nothing seemed to be going right. There wasn't any welfare programs in those days. If you fell through the cracks, there wasn't nothing on the bottom to catch you. But anyway, Ernie come into town, and he had two young girls, beautiful young girls. I married one of them later, but she was, they were Hawaiian hula dancers, and they were very, very good. And Ernie had some clean jokes, real clean jokes. He would talk to the old people, the young people, the kids, and everything else. And he did this at the Spanish Trail, which Maury Adler owned, which was part of the mafia setup here in town. That and the group. But anyway, Ernie was really filling a real good place, because the people were depressed, and Ernie come in and undepressed them. And Ernie, I remember those.
3 shows a night.
3 shows a night. I mean, I see he'd work himself halfway to death.
They filled every show.
And they fill up, everybody be standing to get in. Anyway, I had my family. My family's all grown and old now, but my grandkids never really got to meet him. This will be the first time I get a chance to see him. This time he's coming in here. But my baby girl is 40 years old, so you see, I don't know where the hell the time went, but it did. But Ernie had real good, clean shows, and he put on a good program for that, and he breathed more life in this town and give more hope than most of the Catholic priests or the churches or this other stuff. And people went there, and it was a clean deal. They'd have a few drinks, and most of the people in that couldn't afford much in the way of that. They usually carried their own little flask and all this other stuff. And Adler didn't seem to mind very much. He let most of them get away with most everything. Maury was quite a guy. Well, I used to go to Nevada, and I knew some of the people up there that had, well, they were all tied in with Maury and the rest of them here in town. And that,
so the rest of them.
Yes.
Go ahead, hold on.
had his ties into Nevada, and I'll try to think of some of the names up there in a few minutes. Most of them are dead. I could get away with talking about them now, but it's just getting so. I could talk about enough of these people now. They're dead, and that they won't read the hell of a book. I've got two little stories to tell about Bonnano that I think is really nobody's ever told them. Anyway, Bonnano, I had that trailer court. And you remember when when it started going.
Beautiful.
And I could, right after the war, you couldn't get any telephones. So I knew Carl Hayden, and then I knew all of the politicians that day. And Carl was about as big a man in Washington as you get. He lived long enough that he was a very important man.
Yeah.
He'd come to your shows many times down there. He really drooled over your wife and that and
He could have
her
run
sister.
for president.
He could have run for president. Anyway, he began to get a little slower at the last part of his life. He got a little bit of Alzheimer's disease, and he was slipping down it. And Elkins thought that he could take over his job because he'd been doing it for the last 5 or 6 years, but nobody wanted Elkins. He was just a just a yes man for the old man. But Carl come down here. Now, Carl didn't come down just to see you. Carl had a girlfriend in Arizona. He was an old man, but he had a girlfriend. Her name was Lydia. And he had a deal with Lydia. Lydia opened up a tortilla factory here in town because of the Hayden flour mills. They'd give her all the flour she wanted and all the corn she wanted, and she'd make the day. But she'd come out to your restaurant, and Hayden would come in, and he'd look around to see there wasn't nobody taking any pictures or anything, and he'd come in and he'd sit down with Lydia. But all these politicians, they all had other women and otherwise, and they were pretty safe with Adler. Adler wouldn't let anybody overheard anybody. I mean, the reporters weren't too welcome there most of the time. Anyway, you could go into that. But anyway, when I called to Carl and I said, I can't get a telephone. I can't get a telephone at the ranch except a 15-party line. And I said, at the old country club swimming pool. I said, I've got a swimming pool. I got people that could drown. I couldn't get an ambulance. I couldn't. But more important than that, I filled up a trailer court. I got a 100-unit trailer court going in and out there, and I can't get on the telephone for any of the people from the base. My place is off limits because they can't call them in case of an alert. And he said, well, Joe, I'll do what I can, Carl. And Carl wrote a bunch of letters, and then the phone company wrote him letters back, and they just told him go to hell. And I couldn't get him out of there, and I thought Carl would carry enough weight that he could really do something. Well, Bonnano was laughing at it one day down there, sitting there, right there, your place, your show.
I know exactly.
And Bonnano said, Joe, you're having a little trouble. I said, yeah. He says, you need a few telephones. Sure. He says, you're a struggling guy. He said, I don't know about you. He said, you've got a fence, you got a foot on this side of the fence and a foot on this side of the fence, and you won't commit yourself. You're going to have to get on one side of the fence. He says, everything you got's hanging out in the middle. And he says, you're going to have to get one way or the other. He said, you can't live in two worlds. But he says, you've always been good to Joanne. Joanne was his brother's daughter. And she was a real smart, beautiful girl. And Ernie Haggett, remember him? His dad was Picholo, the head of the musicians union. And we used to go to, they put the musicians union in town here just to give his son something to do. The place is still down there. I don't know anybody goes to it anymore. But he used to be in charge of all of the musicians in Las Vegas. And when we go up there, we'd get a free room and all kinds of deal. And we would go up to Las Vegas, and that's how I got to meet all the people up in Las Vegas and that. So I started bringing used slot machines down. And I got away with it for a little while, put these slot machines in the truck stops. And they'd put them in the back room, and I'd go in, and I committed an unpardonable sin. I'd give the people that was running the truck stop 60% of the money, and I'd take 40. And I met an old guy who was going blind that took care of all the slot machines for Las Vegas. But George Pittman was his name. Hell, what the hell? I ain't gonna live forever anyway. Pittman. But George Pittman would work on slot machines, and he could make sure they worked the way they should and all this other stuff. And they would come and get me, and he said, Joe, will you go with me to Las Vegas? And I'd go up with him. They'd work on the machines, and when they got old, a bunch of old machines, I'd buy a whole truckload of old machines and bring them down here and set them up all over town. And I done real well until that Kefauver got into office. Remember, Kefauver was going to run for president. He's going to clean up the whole world. Well, they sent a squad out here and they butchered the slot machines and they started cleaning up. They arrested politicians right and left and they took everybody away. And I had a couple of attempts made on my life. And when they started shaking up my kids, I went and bought a lot on Mount Lemmon and moved up. And I raised my kids up there. But I was afraid of somebody killing some of them. I didn't know. Now, I never really got into the mafia side and I never got in out the other side. And they never cared much for it. But anyway, back to Bonnano. Bonnano said, well, Joe, he says, I guess you're not too bad of an a-hole. He said, I guess I'll tell you, I'll see if I can't help you a little bit. So Merrill and I left from your place down there and went to the swimming pool. It was just down the road a few miles. And we went down there and there was lights. I mean, big tower lights set up. And there was a dozen phone trucks in the place. And I was looking around, this was after the war. Oh my God, what the hell happened? And I was there, and before I got done, I had 50 telephones that night and the next day. And one of the guys that was the head of the telephone company here later, his son became the county attorney, and he always hated my guts for that. He really hated my guts for what the pressure I guess they put on the telephone company. His name was Wiss, W-I-S-S, and he was a prosecuting attorney. He was for sale, just like a head of cabbage. Anyway, they got him disbarred. That's just recently. And he's still working for the county, doing things on the side. But the corruption come from that area. Now they could never get him out of the planning and zoning, never get him out of here. And they tried a few times. They did some bombings on Joseph Bonnano's home. Remember, a bunch of other stuff. And the guys that did that were police officers, and they caught them all. And if they hadn't caught him, Bonnano would have caught him. You know.
I remember. Used to sit up at that pole in the middle of the place.
Now, I got to tell you this one story about Bonnano. Bonnano was pretty much a character. Bonnano was sitting down at one of your shows one time and that and so forth. And I had a friend of mine who was a skin diver. We did some recovery on some old Spanish ships and a lot of this other stuff. And we went from Florida all over him. He was trained by the Navy. He was real good, and his name was Vern Hamill. He's an old man now. He's 85, 90 years old. Vern Hamill was talking that time, and he said, he told Bonnano and his kids, his boys was there, both boys were there. He said, I know where there's a treasure, a fortune in copper. And he said, where? He said, it's in Panama. He said, during the war, they abandoned some bases, and they had some lines out there, and it's copper, just unbelievable amount of copper down there. He said, if you can get an LSD, we'll take it down there and we'll salvage this stuff. So an LSD, there was a lot of them after World War II. So Bonnano bought him an LSD, one of these big troop landing trips. Yeah. So he didn't have anything to do with it, just the two boys, and they had a bit of adventure on, and Vern Hamill took them down to Panama. Well, they dove down in the area, and they found the copper right where they said he was going to do. So they started underwater cutting, and they loaded that boat down to the fact where it almost sunk. They had all this copper, it had tons and tons and tons of copper on that boat. But then they looked up, and there was a couple big naval boats there, big gunships. And they come over and arrested them, took Bonnano's two kids and Hamill to the local jail in Panama. They tied him up, held him up, and they treated him pretty rough. And what had happened, this was the communication system between Panama and San Diego. And they had been cutting this line, taking it right out of the ocean. Well, Bonnano pulled a lot of strings and went pretty high and got his two kids out of jail. Well, Hamill got to a telephone and said, Joe, go sell the Andorrata property, sell them, I said, get any money you can get out of it. I said, hey, it's a forced sale, I can't get much of anything out of it. I said, I have a hell of a time getting anybody to buy anything. If maybe some of the people you had working for you know you're making money, they'll sell it. And he said, go sell the two houses on Stone. So I said, well, I can take it to a realtor, but if you have to take a quick sale, it's going to be hard. He said, just sell it for whatever you can get out of it and send it down here, and here's the lawyer's name. And he said, this lawyer will get me out of here, and all I need is just a ticket to get the hell. The minute I get out on bond, I'll fly back to Arizona. I did sell the stuff, and I got very little money for it, for what it was really worth. Sent it down to the lawyer. They did get him bonded out, and he flew into Arizona. But now when he got here, he was scared to death that Bonnano was going to kill him. So he went into hiding, and used a fictitious name, and he wrote a couple of stories and books about hunting treasure and stuff all over the world. But he was pretty alive. He had a bunch of kids. He married a Cherokee Indian. She's a real nice woman. She used to take care of my kids in trailer court. They lived right in the trailer court. And Eunice was a wonderful woman. She used a lot of herbs and medicines on your kids if they were sick, and she was a wonderful woman. She had a heart attack and died right in the kitchen one time. And she was taking care of some of my kids at the time. But anyway, Hamill after that really got to associating with pretty low grade women. Some of these soil does, and he never really became much of a. Well, he went downhill from that time on. His wife died. He's still alive. He's an old man, and he was scared to death that Bonnano was going to kill him. Bonnano said, "Joe," he said, "it was a good experience for my kids." He said, "They put them on guard." He said, "They just won't believe everything they hear from now on." He said, "It was an experience." He said, "And I don't want you telling me that you told me so. You told me that Hamill wasn't too trustworthy. You wouldn't let your kids go with him." And I said, "I don't want you telling me that anymore." He says, "You've been warned now. You've said it too much." He said, "I don't want you to even grin when you say something about it." Anyway, he said, I'm not going to bother Hamill. He said, "Just don't tell him." And I never told him. So when Bonnano died last year, a couple of years ago, Hamill was so relieved. Hamill went to see to make sure that they had buried him.
Yeah.
And I told Bonnano's kid about that. He laughed like hell about that way. He come up with a new book. You seen a new book he's got?
No.
The FBI man that used to travel around and watch him, everything he was doing, the kid, they had a man assigned to him for about 25 years, full lifetime job from the kid.
Wow.
Well, him, Joseph Bonnano Jr. and him have gotten together, and they've wrote a book together now. The two of them wrote this book, and Bonnano's kid gave me a copy of it. I'll bring a copy and show it to you if you want to see it. And but you had those people all around you. You were right there in the deal, and they all give you respect here in Las Vegas both. You were. They treated you like Frank Sinatra. They did the same thing with him. And so when you talk about Sinatra, you probably know him better than I do, a lot better. But I got over to California, and my brother would go over to the Van Nuys Chevrolet plant, and they would go over for 3 months out of the year when the winter was on. We didn't have the swimming pool open. We'd go over, and they'd get a job as mechanics at the General Motors plant, and they could work 16, 18, 20, 22 hours a day, and make all this overtime making these new Chevrolets. So they'd come out of there with $25,000 or $30,000 in 3 months, and that was funny. We could work on the pool, work on things over here with, and I'd go over and visit them. And, all the studios would put up a big deal on that, and there was a big plantation-like place, to club downtown they had. But anyway, they would have 3 or 4 levels of bands playing, and Sinatra would always play the top band in that. And I met a woman at a second-hand store over there that was selling antiques, not second-hand, it was antiques to the people in California. Anyway, a lot of junk. But she was, and we come very good, she said, "I've got a couple of tickets." She said, "I'm not going to be able to go." And she said, I'm a guest of the Disney studio. She said, "They brought some stuff from props for me." She gave me 2 tickets. And the bottom floor was open to everybody. The second floor was a little more secure, and the third floor on top of the big Coliseum-like deal was real good. And I had tickets to the top floor. My brother and Larry Hasselden, they went into the front. They had taken off a day just to celebrate New Year's that day. And we went in, and I found out that, and I didn't have much money. It was in the winter, and Maryland did give me very little money to go on, so I went over there with them. And Phil and Larry had all the money in the world, but they were really tight with me. They didn't give me $5 for a taxi, give me $3 or $4 for a beer, and that was a beer cost that much.
Yeah.
And I went over, and I had these. I didn't tell them that I had these passes from this antique store. And when I got over there, I had this identification that would let me get into the 3rd floor. So I got up on the 3rd floor, and I knew quite a few of the people. And Sinatra was one that was entertaining that night. And I'd met Sinatra at the movie set with Dean Martin and a few of the others, and I got pretty friendly with him. So I got to talk to him a few times, and when I did, some of the tables adapted me real close. I mean, I was just adopted like an outsider, and I got in with the Walt Disney Group. And the Walt Disney Group had a bunch of women up here from South America that were, their fathers owned theaters or various other different things that were affiliated with the Disney Group. and they didn't have escorts. This was many years ago. I had a little hair then. And here I went upstairs, and everything was free. Everything was free. But I noticed that if somebody went up a table and go over and get the drinks, and the girls were busy as hell, bring them in when they wanted them. And I got to be a waiter doing it, and they would throw $20, $30, $40 on a tray just to go get them. So I become a waiter in a short period of time there, and later they set me down with some of these girls from South America, and I danced with a few of them back in those days, and everything was going really good. And I had to go down and tell my brother that I had a ride home. Walt Disney had these limousines and was going to take everybody home, so I told him I didn't need him, so I'd get home with myself, and I went down and told my brother we had a real good night. There was a lot of things happening. Sinatra, we got to talking about some other things, talking about Tucson, talking about that, and he invited me over to Palm Springs. He said, "Why don't you come over and visit?" Well, I did. Anyway, before the night was over, everybody was breaking up about 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and the bands were all playing, and everything was going good. So my brother and the bottom place, they were trying to get rid of the commoners earlier, so they were waiting out front for me. And I walked down and I thought, well, I better go to the restroom before I didn't tell them, and then I'll tell them I got a ride home. So I went down and I told my brother and Larry, I said, I got a ride home. And Larry was looking at it and said, look at him. He's damn near drunk. Look at his glaze. He's got his eyes are glazed. He's almost drunk. How in the hell could he get drunk on $3 or $4 when the beer cost that much? And I said, don't worry about it. And I went up and picked up the 2 girls that was going back to their hotel. And I went and got in one of the Disney limousines, and all the rest of them. Sinatra was coming out about it at the time. He said, "Joe, you remember you're gonna come over? I'll be over there. I'll be over tomorrow." And I said, "Okay." And that was it. My brother and Larry's mouth was hanging on the ground, you know? But it just happened, kind of a deal. And it was we left the place that night, and Bill and them was trying to get up the next morning. I finally took a cab and went over, and I had waited on tables for these people, and I had $200 or $300 in cash, and that bothered my brother. He wondered what the hell I did to get $200 or $300. But anyway, I went over to spent 2 days with Sinatra over there, and I went with him, drove him around. I was just like his driver, drove him around several places, and they had just opened up a place called the Cordoveras Club. Sinatra owned a piece of it, Dean Martin owned a piece of it, and the whole pack rat owned a little piece of it. And they opened it up, and they used the Roman props that was in a Roman movie in that club. And one of the things that I liked real good is he had a big picture of David, and made a carving, and they had a fig leaf on David covering the parts there, and they put that in a women's restroom. And they had rigged it up electronically. If you moved the film to see what was under it, it would set off alarms and but all of them had a sense of humor. I never asked them for anything, and I got along real good with them. And it was,
I knew when I was performing, I knew when he was coming in, because we were on the barge, Cliff after the barge, and they'd be setting up a bar way in the back. I said, Frank's coming in.
Yeah.
You know,
always drunk a lot.
They're setting up his bar back there.
The object was with him to get him home and get him in bed without him knowing that you were helping him. And you were in real good friends down there. And he wasn't a big man. He didn't like people sitting over him. He liked you always kind of make sure the chair you got into or the stool you sit on was low. He always had a couple of these hoods around him that were, he was always wondering if they was all there.
When he goes in the restroom, he goes alone.
Nobody goes in, nobody goes out. It was interesting. It was very interesting to be with people like him. Dean Martin, Dean's son, hit a mountain, and we were tearing down a building over at Yuma, the proving ground over there. I took all that out. I took all the big Quonset hut down, and I numbered each one of the buildings. So I was going to put it back. I thought maybe someday I'd have an airplane. I could have my own hangar. I never got around to that yet, but I still got it all. And we tore it down. And while we were there, Dean Martin's kid was making a run over the Goldwater Brewing Range, and one of the bombs hung up. And they couldn't get it shut loose. He made several trips on it and so forth. So they told him to take it to Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix. And if he could get to Williams, they could foam the runway, and they could. Well, he went to Phoenix, and he's on his way to Phoenix, and the plane got unstable, wobbled, and it took it down on a mountain just on this side of Phoenix, and killed him, killed his boy. So he came over with some retired general and some other people, and he come in and landed at the place where we were tearing his hangar down at the airport with a Lear. And he got off the Lear, and this retired general and some other people, he wanted to know what happened. He wanted to know what happened to his boy, what killed his boy. And Janie was very insistent. Janie was a hell of a wife. Without her, he'd have never had a damn nickel. She would limit him to just a little bit of money, and she invested money in real estate. When he died, God almighty, they were wealthy, very wealthy. He had a lot more money than Frank, but she had a woman that took care of him. Now, Frank got a woman at the last part. He got one of the Three Stooges' wives. Then she was smart as hell. She pulled him around, straightened him up. Now, poor old Sammy Davis, he didn't have that kind of luck. The Internal Revenue took his wife's rings off her fingers when they buried him. They took all the rings off his fingers before they buried him. The government owed him that. It was unbelievable. They stripped him down to nothing. Anyway, I was really close to. I got real close to him. I had 2 or 3 experiences. It was really unusual. They were filming a movie out at Old Tucson, and Sheldon told me they were out there, and I went out to the commissary. And somebody was swimming in a public swimming pool out there one time, and a guy lost an eye in the pool. And Marilyn said, well, wait till they sweep the pool down, and it'll probably end up in a hair and lint catcher. So sure as hell, they ended up in a hair and lint catcher, and he called and said, I'll be over to get it. And he never came over to get it. I don't know if the guy died or had a heart attack or what, but that eye laid around there for years and years and years. And I used to have people come in and visit me and so forth. I pick the eye up and I take it into a Chinese restaurant or some other place and have soup and that. And I'd look down at the bottom of the soup and I'd ask the guy to come over. I had a Chinaman come out with a cleaver one time. It wasn't funny to him at all. But anyway, I would take that around and I had a lot of fun with that eye for a long time. So we went out that time to the commissary out here. And when we was there, and Dean Martin was there and so forth, and they brought out the soup. We had some soup and sitting there. And then I called up and I showed the eye to it. Everybody was just horrified. They brought the cook out of the kitchen, all the rest of that people, and Dean Martin was in tears. He was laughing all over the floor. You do something to have it. He said, I want the eye. And I said, oh, I'm really attached to that eye. He said, I want the eye. I want the eye real bad. He said, I'll give you some of my damn allowance for the eye. And I said, no, go ahead, take it. And he took it, and he called the script writer over. He said, I want you to draw this in. He said, no, the script is set. And he said, no, he said, I want to draw it in. He said, I want something in it. He said, I want to have a scene in there about finding this eye or doing the same thing we did right here or do something. Well, the script writer got in there and they did draw it in. I don't remember which movie it was, but they did draw the eye in, and he was coming in and he auctioned his eye off. He had a Band-Aid he put over his eye, and he auctioned his eye off. He didn't have a glass eye. He auctioned it off, and then the guys all would bid on the eye, and they'd take the money. And then the guy that got it, he'd go talk to him and talk him out of the eye. And in the movie, he was trying to talk the guy out of the eye, and the guy didn't want to sell the eye. And so he had to wear a phony patch over his eye or get caught for being a con man. But anyway, it was all drawn in the way, and it's just funny how that was drawn in. And they fought him nail, tooth, and comb. They wasn't going to let that happen, and he was insisted they were going to put it in, and they put it in. But he was quite a character. But then when his son got killed and came over to Yuma, he was over there, and he said, well, what are you doing over here, Blankenship? I said, oh, I'm feeling real bad about your boy. I'd heard about what happened. And he said, well, come on in and we'll have a drink. And I went in here, all the whole brass was there. All the people at the military sent people from all over was there. They had an inquest going on right now, what happened and so forth. And they was all talking about it, and they was all telling him about what a tragedy it was. And I said, no, I hollered out, no, it wasn't a tragedy. I said, he's a hero. I said, he took that damn thing down. He had a live bomb on the thing, and I said he knew if he went into Phoenix, how many people was he going to kill? Yeah. That's the first time I'd hit him that way. By God, after that, there wasn't an empty glass in my table again. I mean, I went away from that drunken hell. My brother had to come get me. Mm-hmm. But he made sure that I had hit the right nerve. I've been real good about the pecking order. I can figure out who the chief is, in them Indians, and that's the one he's supposed to shoot first. But God, he married the right woman. I think we all did. You did. Yeah. I did. I got the same one I started with. I put $2 up for a license, and that license has never retired. I go get a dog license every year. I go get a driver's license every year or two. I go get a license for the car, but that $2 goes on forever, don't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And they had little colored guys that would bring beer to you and wine and all this other stuff, and they had they had nice ladies, and they educated them pretty good. He had a place called Joe's, the Flamingo deal on Nogales Highway. And it was a big house that set back, had about 35 or 40 rooms in there, and it had a big gambling casino. And Joe Cheatwood run that for the mafia. But anyway, but let me tell you, I worked for a construction company. I'd go down to Nogales, and I had rigged up a little 55-gallon jug that I'd work on the trucks, and I'd fill the trucks up with gasoline. But I took a 5-gallon can and welded it around the top, and then I painted the whole top over again. And I would fill the, and I had a pump, and I would pump out diesel. But under it would be 50-gallon of Bacanora. The old alcohol, the old moonshine. And I supplied, even to Maury, I supplied moonshine to them. And they would, during the war, it was hard to get good liquor. So they'd take 6 liquor bottles and they'd fill them up and do a little dye on them and sell them and that. And I sold them to the Open Door, I sold them to the Chanticleer, I told them all the places that, and I sold liquor to them when I was working for the company. The company. Anyway, I used to get a case of Fondadori once in a while that I could get across the line. I'd smuggle that across the line, and I'd give that to Bonnano. And I'd give him a case of Fondadori. That was a brandy from Spain, I think. I don't know. I never drunk this stuff. I wasn't much into alcohol. I never was much on it, but I made a few dollars on it. I bought that land and stuff. I always had a shingle, you know.
Yeah.
And during the war, I had another deal going. I was working for Coca-Cola Bottling Company, George Martin. And George Martin, I would deliver liquor around town, and I would deliver Coca-Cola. And he'd work me on Saturdays and Sundays on real. And once in a while, sometime for New Year's, he'd make some real Coca-Cola. And we'd bring a drum, and I'd go pick up at Nogales, and I'd tuck this syrup and put it in there. And I know that I never really realized that much, but I was on the inspection deal. Once in a while, a rat would go into a Coke bottle and eat some peanuts that was in the bottom of it, and the rat couldn't get out of the bottle. And he sure as hell didn't want that to get out to the public. So I'd sit on a big magnifying glass, and they'd go by, and I'd have to make the syrup upstairs. And I was a one-man dead one. I knew something was wrong when he would just let me clean all the bottles, and then let me go upstairs and make the Coke syrup, and then I'd come downstairs, and then I had to inspect the bottles as they come off the bottler. And then those would always be labeled in a deal, and they spray the cartons red. There'd be a red spot on each one of the cartons. And he would never let anybody else touch those. Those would go in a room, and then I was to deliver those. I was delivering all the city fathers and all the rest of the stuff like that. And that was real Coca-Cola. One time I was reading really hard, and you couldn't go away from the place. You couldn't even go to the bathroom when you was watching the people coming down. You couldn't shut down the whole deal. Had to run. And I got dry and thirsty, so I just reached up and got one of the bottles off the deal and snapped the top off it, and I drunk it. Oh, man, I tell you, it was a full orchestra playing for me there, and there were all kinds of lights and colors and everything else. So I took a few home. But old man George Martin, but that was back in the good old days in that time. But I delivered a lot of Coke to all these places. I delivered Coke when I was a kid to Adler there when Adler was trying to put that place together. Had a lot of trouble getting building material, and after the war, and I could go to some of the little towns that they were tearing down some buildings, or particularly when they put a road through a place, and I'd get the doors and that stuff, and I'd paint the doors up. And I'd sell used doors to Adler and that, and I got real good prices for them. I was, and then when I was delivering Coca-Cola, once a month I would take a load of Coca-Cola to the prison camps. This was during the war. And they had a Japanese internment camp that had 19,000 people in it. And the 19,000 people was up there. They had them stacked on top of one of like cordwood up there. And they were good people, and they were healthy. And they had understood this Oregon effect. They understood about the rusty screens and letting the air go through and circulating the air and keeping no dead air in the pockets, no pockets anywhere. And they were a lot healthier because of it. And these Japanese, I got pretty friendly with them. A lot of them talked better English than me. A lot of them were they were Americans. They were Americans. They were nothing. They were Japanese. It was a criminal of what they did to those people. And so I got friendly with them, and they were raising vegetables. Oh God, they had beautiful gardens. You couldn't believe what they had. They understood the iron oxide. They understood all the things that, and they would hum and sing to their stew that they made that they put on top of the gardens, and they would sing into it. They put a hum into it. And they grew things up there you couldn't believe. So I'd take the back of the Coca-Cola truck. They had a place there where you take empty cartons. And before I'd leave the place down there, I'd put in 10 or 12 cases of Coke in there. Then I had my trading stock. I'd go up, and they didn't have any money, so I'd trade them bottles of Coke And for the vegetables. And I'd take all these vegetables and put them in there and put wet socks over them and take them. And I'd go around and try to sell these vegetables before they went. And if anybody knew where they come from, then them Japs were going to kill us for sure. You know, they wouldn't take them. But I'd tell you, I'd have a deal with the Indians out here, and I was getting some Indian products in. But these Indians would buy them from me too. It was good stuff. It was very good stuff. Well, the stuff would go bad on me in 2 or 3 days. Then somebody put me on the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had these nuns up there they was trying to raise and all this other stuff, and they loved these vegetables. And what they would say, they said, well, Joe, we don't have any money either. We can sell you cheese. We'll give you cheese for them. And I said, where the hell are you getting cheese? You know, during the war. They said, oh, Mrs. Bonnano. Mrs. Bonnano brings the cheese over to the church, and she's keeping all of our priests, and cheese is coming from Italy. So they'd take the cheese over there, and cheese was, oh man, a guy had a restaurant was trying to make pieces. I mean, there wasn't enough gold in the world to get it. You know, it was really a prime subject. It was something, and the cheese wouldn't spoil. God, I have cheese for months and months and months, and it got around town that Joe was a cheese man. And I sold a lot of cheese that I got from Mrs. Bonnano would take it to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church would train it for vegetables, and I was getting the vegetables from the Japanese internment camp up there. And in the process, I delivered a lot of coke to the German internment camp. They had Hermann Göring made a deal that any German flyers come down, they were not to be subject to interrogation, or that flyers were gentlemen. And the flyers would go to another base that had airplane base. So a good safe base was out here, Davis-Monthan. So they had hundreds of these flyers that were shot down as Germans that they had captured and bring them out there. Well, I found out they had gardens, fantastic gardens. Those officers, those German officers, raised garden stuff out there. So I got to trading coke for them, and they said, one of the guys cut me over and said, Joe, we could sure use some black bread. We just crave black bread, and we'd like some liverwish. Done. So I went down and I got, the old man Zappia had a bakery here in town, and he would make black bread for me. He was an Italian. He always said he was a Vietnamese so that people wouldn't bother him, but the old man Zappia had a bakery, and I'd get these, and I'd get some of these cookies. He had cookies called ones a meal, big cookies. And I'd trade him out of that, and I'd leave him some Coke, and he would take the Coca-Cola, and he would put them in his store, and I would take the black bread, and I'd go down to Liverwish, get the Liverwish from the packing house down there where they made the Liverwish and take it out to them. And these Germans would take a piece of that Liverwish and a piece of that black bread, and you'd think they had a sexual climax. So they'd eat that, they'd just sit there and just go through this. And then you could go over to the officers' club and leave a whole bunch of Coke in there. And these officers, these flyers, would sit there and have big prime ribs and big steak. Meat, you couldn't get that kind of meat in that day. Eat about half of it and take a cigarette out and put a cigarette out and have a steak. I mean, it would just make you sick, you know, that we had everything, they had nothing, and yet they enjoyed life, I think, a little better than we did. So I got in with those German people, and I got to know them real well. A few of them broke out one time, got away from the place out there, and the war was almost over right at the end. And they were on their way to South America. They were going to go down to Mexico, and they got caught at the border. But they stopped and told me goodbye before they went out there. I didn't know how to turn them in or I didn't know what to do. I just said, let it go, hell, what the hell, it ain't none of my business. But anyway, they were real nice people. And after the war, Howard Hughes set up with Harold Ashton a place to train soldiers. And they were training these Germans. And right now, they're training Japanese out here at the Rhine. But anyway, they trained them up here at Marana. And they would train them for years and years and years up there. And these kids, these grown men would say, stop and see Joe. See, he was always good to us during the war. He didn't have any animosity to Germans, and he was just an average Joe. And so they would stop in, and then their kids would come in. Now, this has been 3 generations. Their kids are stopping in. They'll come out at Ryan Field, and they'll come over and say, are you the Joe? Are you the Joe? Are you the Joe? And Grandpa used to say this, Grandpa would say, look us up, and that and so forth. But they started getting meat, and one of the county supervisors had a ranch, had a place up here, they called Little Abner's.
Oh yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Anyway, but they were actually getting rustled meat. They were taking, they had some guys that go out and steal a cow now and then and so forth. His son got in trouble counterfeiting. I thought he really got the base of money, and they arrested him for that. I've run into a lot of unusual people. The old German told me, he said, Joe, he said, they're going to have a fella come up here from Alabama. he's coming up this next week, and he's going to speak at the university at Chattanooga there. He's going to talk over there at the deal, and he said, would you, I think you'd enjoy going and listen to him. But he said, if you go, I'd like you to go in. If you could take some notes, I'd appreciate it. And I said, well, where's he going to be? And he said, well, he's going over to talk at the auditorium. And they had a big auditorium there, and they had put it out in the paper that he was going to show up. Well, I went down to the station to get him, and because he had told me that he was colored. In Chattanooga, there was two different places where you come in. If you were colored, you had one other section you came in. They wouldn't even let the colored people eat at the same counters, and they had colored bathrooms and all that other stuff. Well, the university sent a car over, but the guy that went over there, they didn't tell him the guy was colored. So he was over there waiting for him at the white deal, and he didn't show up and so forth. But I was over at the colored deal, and he did show up. The old man got off with this slouchy-looking suitcase that had two ropes tied around it, and he got off. And I walked up to him, and I asked him if he was Mr. Carver. He said yes. And I said, they're supposed to send a truck for you, a car for you. And he said, well, they do. He said, a lot of times they don't. Now he said, how far is it? I said, it's not too far. I said, down Broad Street here. I said, we'll go over to the auditorium. And he said, let's go. And I started going. I said, let me carry your bag. I was a younger, strong teenage kid. And he said, come on, white boy, you get us both killed. And we started walking down the street, and he started, and I realized what a wonderful person he was at the time, and I thought maybe he was a little deranged, because as we walked by on Broad Street there, where we were going down, people had high bench on the street. And then their lawns would go up higher, and then the houses sit on a hill, a little hill on top. A lot of them would plant flowers along the edge. And he would look at these flowers, and he would talk to these plants, these little flowers. He'd pick them up and hold them, and he'd ask if that flower minded him putting him in his buttonhole and so forth. He'd put him in his buttonhole. And he would talk to these plants. He talked to these flowers. He talked to them. And I'm not so damn sure they didn't talk back to him. I thought it was kind of weird, but we got down to the place down there, and of course I came in with him, and they was a little late, and everybody was glad to have him come in, and because of that I got a seat up front. They put me up front. He asked for it, and I got it. I got up front, and later Dr. Leimbach came in, and Dr. Leimbach came up, and I sat down between his legs, and Leimbach sat up front, and we talked to that, and afterward Mr. Carver talked to Leimbach and I both. But he was such a gentle giant. He was such a small man. He told me several things that normally he wouldn't talk. He said when he first went over to the university there, they would give him checks. And he said he wasn't really sure what the checks were, so he just threw them in a drawer. And he said he finally told him that he couldn't afford to stay anymore. He had to have some money. And they said, well, we're giving you checks all the time. So he had to go down and cash some of the checks, but he had run out of the money that he had when he come over there. So Roosevelt would come through, and he would come in a train to Chattanooga, and then he would take a car from Chattanooga to Warm Springs, Georgia. But a lot of times he would go to a fort out there at Fort Oberthout. Fort Oberthout was made into a large women's whack camp. They had, I think, 40 or 50,000 women that were doing things for the war out there. In many ways, thousands of them. And he would go over to the camp and see the girls over there and so forth. And he had a big touring car. And he'd come in spring or fall, mostly down to Warm Springs, Georgia. And he found out that we found out that he was crippled. And they would drive to a place between Georgia and Chattanooga there, a place called the Iowa Monument. The state of Iowa had erected a huge, tall monument with soldiers on it that had died from Iowa and in the Civil War, and they had these carved figures around it, 5 or 6 men around it with guns and cannons, and a man on the top carrying a flag. They kept this always trimmed, real nice and clean, and they kept an iron fence around it. And he would pull off into that area there, and they had a masseuse, a woman, that would come and massage his legs. And while he was there, and the Secret Service would not let you go up. Well, there was a couple of kids, me and another boy was up there, and we walked right up to him, and he said, let him come up there, and he was asking us different things. And I was kind of a rebellious kid even when I was young. And he said, are you going to vote for me? And I said, we're too young to vote. And he said, yeah, that's true, but would you vote for me? And I said, well, I'll tell you, Mr. President, I read Wilkie's book, One World. I still got that book even to this day. And I said, I'm kind of leaning toward Wilkie. I think Wilkie is a real bright man. It's got more feeling for little people than that. And he got to laughing like hell. He just started laughing like hell. He was laughing. He just shook all over when he's laughing on me. And some of the other guys got a little upset, I guess, with him. But he said, leave him be. He said, what's your name? And I told him I was Joe. He said, what are you? He said, aren't you supposed to be in school today? And I said, I don't go to school a hell of a lot of time. I said, I work a lot. I said, my brother's got polio, 2 of them. And I said, my dad's an arthritic. And I said, I try to bring a little money in home quite a bit. But I said, I go to school whenever I get a chance. And I said, I got an old German that helped me a little bit on reading and a few other things. And we was talking quite a bit. We got talking quite back and forth. And so I used to get a card when he would be going through Chattanooga. And so I'd always go up to the Iowa Monument, and I'd get with him and talk to him, and we'd talk about various things. He invited my dad and my brother down to Warm Springs, Georgia. So we'd get on a Greyhound bus and go down to Warm Springs, Georgia. And he had a place down there for the March of Dime people, and the March of Dime place all of his help. There were 2 different places. And the March of Dime supported the little area where they had there. And he told me that, he said, we got a government-sponsored thing in Hot Springs, Arkansas. It's called the Government Bathhouse. And he said they've been very helpful with exercising people. And he said, Sister Kenny works on the people over there. He said, take your brother over there a time or 2. So we'd get back, and I'd save up a little bit of money, and we'd get on a Greyhound bus and go over to Hot Springs, Arkansas. We got to meet a lot of people over there. But the fact that I had a note from him, I didn't have no trouble getting in a government bathhouse. And but it was very easy. And I learned something the German told me about that one time. He said, you're way ahead of most people, Joe. He said, I don't want you to see you working in the coal mines, which you're doing in the spare time, and I don't want your lungs eat out. He said, I want you to get the hell out of here as quick as you can and read all your life, no matter what you get. Read anything. I don't care if it's funny books or whatever. Read. Just read, because you enjoy reading. And he said, and from it you can't help but get something out of it, no matter what you read. And the old German told me that, and the old German said something to me. He said, you can meet anybody you want to meet. He says, you just can't go up and talk to him like you've done to the president. He said, that doesn't happen. But he says, you can always find somebody that knows the president. You can find a politician or somebody in town that knows him, and that person you can get him to go take you up to. He said, you're only one handshake away from any person you ever want to meet. He's a young kid in Rossville, Georgia. This is Ross's Landing. That's right next to Chattanooga. But the Indians had a sacred ground in there. That's where Chief John Ross had his home and all the other stuff. Most of the Cherokees lived in that area. Well, they made like a pilgrimage, or every year the Indians would go down to his place and say their hallelujahs and all that other stuff. And go all the way through. So I lived just about a half a block from there. And this was not the best end of town. This was on the other side of the track, as you would say. And it was in Georgia.
Give me a year.
We were just a short distance from the state line. This is in 1940s. And 41, 42, 43, the war came on, and I was going to school there. We had a German professor. His name was George Lambach. And he was an American, but he was born in Germany. And Lambach was a very unusual man. He had an accident, and one of his eyes had been knocked out at a piece of a chip off of a .22 rifle. He got in his eye, and they removed one of his eyes. He was the principal of the Rossville school system, but the fact that he was German, there was a lot of the people didn't want him teaching kids, and didn't want him. And he had a home on top of a mountain right there, Sand Mountain. And he had one of the finest farms I'd ever seen in my life. He raised stuff that was out of this world. And he was the first one that I learned about the accelerated plant growth with oxides of iron, and I learned about lignites being a natural supplement for feeding. He made watermelons that were huge in size, and they were the sweetest things you could ever eat. But nobody would buy his watermelons. They thought he was going to try to poison them because he was a German and this and so forth. He had a couple of girls, and he needed somebody to help him one time. He didn't use insecticides, pesticides, and he had many different ways of working this. Mr. Leimbach took a liking to me. I had a lot of questions asked, and I read a lot. I read an awful lot of his books. Matter of fact, I caught writing book reports for the rest of the kids in school. And he kind of took me under the wing, and he would give me a dime an hour to help him do various things on his farm. Well, that's where I learned about the vibrations putting into manure that you had stirred and various different things, the singing to it, and the things that he was doing to it was really, people would think you were crazy at that time. It was kind of proved out by some of these people that's done things in Europe and Feinstein, and you know what I'm talking about. But he was a very brilliant man. He taught school part-time mathematics and astrology, and he was a very unusual man. And a bunch of them got together, and they didn't want a German teacher in their kids' school during World War II. So they fired him. They got a man named Brooklyn or something come over, who didn't have half. He was a real teacher. And I got into trouble with the new teachers. I couldn't get them to talk, and I couldn't communicate with them the way I would did with him. And so I spent a lot of time up at his farm, and he would take me out in the nights when it was evening. He'd always feed me and had real good food. And he was always showing me how to grow better plants and how to make things work. Georgia is made up of a lot of clay, red clay, and the clay will bind a lot of the plants, and you don't get much growth on it. They bore the soils out with cotton, and most of the bottom land is all depleted of any minerals. But he had this mountaintop, and he raised some of the most beautiful peaches, some of the finest peaches I guess anybody in the world could ever eat. Nobody would take his peaches, and I would take a red wagon. I was just a teenager, a young kid, and I'd take them and load them up in a wagon, a big high-top wagon, and drag them down off the mountain. It's all downhill. And I'd take them, and I'd go out into Dewberrytown, which is a colored community. And I started selling some of the stuff out there, and they didn't have any money. They never had any money. Fridays, you'd get a little bit of money out of them, get a few nickels or dimes out of them. Colored people didn't have anywhere. They was in really a state of depression, even during the war. They never got out of it. And my father was crippled with arthritis. He was crippled, he was bedfast. And I had two brothers, and both of them had polio. One of them finally died, and my other brother survived it, and he's the one that you saw just a few minutes ago. But we grew up as poor white trash in the South. I mean, if something like that happened, you had to be in bad faith with God, because it was God's deal that you were sick, or your family was sick, and the preachers and everybody made a big issue out of it at that and so forth. But there was a lot of people had diabetes was quite common, but most of it was black lung. Very few people worked in the mines, in the coal mines down there, had decent lungs. They all died very young. And there was no welfare programs, there was no health programs. John L. Lewis came on board right during the middle of the war. And he started screaming and hollering that there was somebody going to take care of these miners, and they weren't going to die the way they were dying without any money. And so he put a sure tax of $1 on every ton of coal. And the coal miners wouldn't buy this, or the owners. So they went on a strike. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt got really nasty about the strike, sent down a bunch of strike breakers and everything else, and said it was against the war effort and so forth. But they finally did get $1 per ton set aside for the health of the miners. Nobody had ever taken care of them before. So this big bushy-eyed guy with big burly hair, they called him a communist, but he did a real good thing for the people of the South. They got a hospital built, and they got all this, and I got very friendly with him. I met him a few times and talked to him about it. And he knew I was playing around with coal. My family was all very poor, and I worked a lot of seams out in the mines that had already been mined out, and sold the coal to people there for 20, 30 cents a bushel. And I made a little bit of money to help supplement our home, our family, and my mother. We had electricity, and a lot of people didn't have electricity, which I think was only 60, 70 cents a month. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt put the Chickamauga Dam in there, and when he did that, they put rural electric out to everybody, and it was practically nothing. It was just 60 cents, I think it was, a month. But it's a lot of months we had trouble even raising the 60 cents to keep the electric on. And we all had outhouses. This is the reason why the South was hit so hard with polio. Polio is an infection, and it comes about when people don't have really good hygiene, if they don't wash their hands after going to the bathroom and things like that. There's no question about it now, there's confirmation on that. The Sister Kennedy Foundation come down there and treated a lot of people with polio. Hundreds and thousands of people had polio. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio. Of course, that got a lot, the March of Dimes got into the picture. And he had a winter home at Warm Springs, Georgia, was down the road a little ways. And I got to running with the Indians in there, and the Indians would take and mine gold. At Delenica, that was the first place in Delenica, Georgia. That was the first place that they had a mint. They actually minted coins there. That was the first American mint. They made gold. They took the gold out of the area there. They never got much of the gold because it was in clay, and clay would steal most of the gold. If it stick to it, and you wouldn't get it out. It was hard to separate with water. We tried everything with wetting agents, and lye was a pretty good way of taking it out. So you could take lye and separate some of the gold. And the Indians were pretty sharp on this. They figured they didn't have tin pans and things to mine the gold, but they would take a cow's horn, a big cow's horn, and saw it in half, and they would work it back and forth in there, and the heavies would drop at one end. And they were real good at that. And I went down with the Indians, and the Indians would get beat out of the gold. If they, when they had a light-colored person with them, they a lot of the Cherokees are very light-colored, but they would take the gold that they had, and there was only 2 or 3 places they would buy the gold. One was a dentist, and the other was bartenders that they'd swap whiskey and wine for gold, and they didn't have scales. And they would measure the gold by a pinch. And the Indians was trying to sell their gold, they'd always try to find a skinny bartender or a skinny dentist who would buy the gold. And whatever they could take between their fingers, the finger and the thumb, and shake off the rest of it, that was a pinch. That pinch was worth a pint of moonshine, or it was worth a little bit. Gold was only $22 an ounce then. And this gold wasn't 1999 fines, it was just good, but it was very, very pure gold. They would take it, if a fee grabber, we call them fee grabbers, a government revenue, or any of the rest of them caught them making booze, but they made a little extra money by grabbing Indians that had a little gold on them, and they'd take it away from them. Just take it away from them and turn them loose. And so it was pretty hard to get. If they had a young kid with them, and the kid would have the poke, why, they very seldom went through the kid real heavy. And usually you take the poke and tie it to your belt and hang it between your legs. These pig grabbers didn't look there very much. And we'd take and sell a little bit of gold. They'd always give me a little bit of the gold, and I found people who would buy the gold. And I got a lot of the Indians signed up on food stamps. Not food stamps, they were war stamps. The war stamps were they were victory stamps, they called them. And everything was rationed. Sugar was rationed, bacon was rationed, everything was on a ration. You had to have these war coupons before you could buy sugar or this other stuff. I took these Indians down and signed them up, and get them signed up, and they would give me the books. And I'd give them part of the gold or whatever to go with them, and I had a kind of an exchange deal going with it. And there was 2 lakes over there. They were Hutchinson Lakes, and they had one lake had a spring that fed it on the top, and then they had a big pipe that went across the deal. And I used to take a tow sack over there, just a potato sack, and hang it over there at night, and then go get it early morning before any of the game wardens or anybody would go through, and I'd have a bag full of fish. It would go from the upper lake to the bottom lake. And so I kept the Indians in dried fish and other stuff that was going through there. So we got along real good, and I used these food stamps, and I could go buy sugar. Well, sugar was a real premium. Everybody wanted to buy sugar from you, and they'd buy for the food stamps, and I could sell them food stamps or sell them sugar, whatever they wanted. The moonshiners would a whole lot rather have sugar, and if you sell them the sugar, they'd say that they'd like to trade you moonshine for it. And I had a little business. I now remember, I'm just a teenager, just barely a teenager, and I'd go get grape Kool-Aid and cut the moonshine, which was about 170, 180 proof alcohol, 10, 20 times, and put a little bit of it in grape Kool-Aid or that, and fill in these cider jugs, big jugs, fill them up and sell them to the colored people down there. And on Friday, they'd have a little bit of money. Now, they could always raise enough money to get a bottle of wine. They thought it was wine, but it was Kool-Aid with a little moonshine in it. And I'd get a little bit of money on that, and I supplemented my raising my brother and my mother. My mother was working for Peerless Woolen Mill, and they were paying her during the war 10 cents an hour. And she worked 10 hours a day, and we had barely enough to eat. But we lived pretty well on that because I have these little things. I wasn't a shyster. It's just that it was something that just come along that I had to supplement our income with. So I was always had a little bit of money, and the moonshiners would be tickled to death to get the sugar. I'd accumulate 200 or 300 pounds of sugar, and they'd come in, usually with a guy that had an armed guard that would come in with them and drop off a few jugs of White Lightning, and everybody in the town knew that they could get it from me. And I had an uncle that was kind of a real shyster. He didn't have any education at all. He was one of my dad's brother. He grew up with, my father had taught him how to sign his name, and that's about the extent of it. He had a tremendous memory. He could remember people's names, places. He could listen to 2 ball games at the same time and keep both ball games apart with 2 radios. So he was not dumb. He just wasn't educated. And he would take a pair of overalls and had a 2-inch piece of pipe, and he threaded on the inside and threaded on the top, and he would clean that pipe out real good and fill it full of moonshine. And he'd go downtown in Chattanooga, and he would take this, and he had cut it off just so it would go in an elevator, 5 foot 8 or 9 inches, just barely go in an elevator. And he'd carry a pipe wrench and that piece of pipe all over town. He'd go to these doctors' offices, these lawyers' offices, and all that stuff, and they would have the jugs waiting for him, and they'd have a funnel, and they'd take the tap out of the end of it, and he drove a brand new Ford back in the days when there weren't no new Fords. I mean, he was very interested in colored girls. He had a lot of colored women that went with him everywhere you'd go, and he was quite a character. He lived to be about 90 years old. Come out and visit us a few times out here. I took him up on Mount Lemmon, and we had a nice house up there. My dad called me over one day and said, I haven't had any fruit here in a long time. I said, my God, I'm shipping up here by the lugs. I said, every week goes by and I send 2 or 3 lugs of fruit up here. He said, well, I'm not getting a single piece of fruit. So I went down to the basement and looked around, and Uncle Louis had a little camp stove, a still set up out of a copper pan, and a still on the top of that, and had some water set up that he run the still through, and he was making moonshine on the mountain out of the fruit. He was fermenting it, and had half of the mountain up there was drinking booze with him. But Uncle Louis was quite a character. He passed away after he was about 90 years old, but he spent some time out here with us. I went to work in Arizona. I came out to Arizona for my dad's health and my brother's health and that. And we came out here, and the war was still going on. And this old German, back to him, he taught me a lot about the growth of plants and how things were growing. And he told me about Victor Schumberger in Germany, who had done things by getting energy out of water that people couldn't measure and all that. Well, eventually, in time, some of these Germans that he told me about had papers printed in England, and I'd get copies of those papers from England. So I got interested in water right from the very beginning, and I got out here in Arizona, and water was such a premium here. Very few people got much, so I learned how to structure water so that you could get more water out of the use of the water you had by running it through iron oxide crystals and putting it on plants. And if people were buying water from the city, it would really cut the hell down on their property on that. See, iron oxides will actually structure water to a point where it'll go right to the plant and it doesn't evaporate. The evaporation is almost eliminated on it. Once the water is tuned with the proper frequencies in it, it'll go right into the plant. The plant just sucks it in like a magnet. So if we ever got to really looking at using the iron oxide crystals to accelerate plant growth. And I told Dr. Phil Callahan about this, and he did a lot of research on it. He wrote 2 or 3 books on this. Phil Callahan was at the University of Florida at Gainesville. So I corresponded with him for years and years. We'd go to national meetings for farmers to go, mostly organic farmers. They had their own little places, sometimes up as far as Minnesota. And I'd go up and meet with them and talk to them. I came out to Arizona and I started 2 houses I built. I built all the blocks, made them myself. I didn't buy a block or nothing. I just made a form and filled them full of a wheelbarrow full of cement and go, and after I made 10 of them, the next day to make another 10, another 10. And I got to lay in 10 the same day. I'd make another 10 and let them dry out. So I built 2 houses, and one we rented out. And rent was pretty much of a premium at that time. And during the war, nobody had built any houses through the war. And I usually rented to military people at Davis-Monthan. And I run into Tibbet, who was the man that dropped the atomic bomb over there. He drank a lot, and he had a wife named Helen. And Tibbet lived in my houses over there for years for that, but he was pretty much drunk most of the time. But I got to fly with him different places. He had a high rank deal, so I could get I'd go out with him, and if I got in behind the base, behind the flight line, no problem at all. And I'd put up $1. They charge you $1 for a parachute. Never had to use one, but they'd give you a parachute for $1. And we'd go then the first war, the Korean War, came out, and we went over to Japan, not Japan, to Hawaii, and I had to stay on the base because if I got off the base, I couldn't get back on, I couldn't get in the plane. But I got to see quite a bit of the bases over there and brought a few trinkets and toys back. And I married a woman here in Tucson. I met, a Swede. But I run with the Indians for gold all the way through the South, and I got into gold. And when I came out to Arizona, I started getting into gold too. I started visiting all the old gold mines, and I went over to the University of Arizona, and they let me set in on a lot of the mining classes, and I learned a lot from Dr. Willard Pye. Took me in almost like a son, and he was one of the top geologists over there, and so I spent time at his house and with his wife, and I got a little education all of my own, one-on-one, just like I did with the old German back in the South. And Dr. Pye and I were friends for all of his whole life. He died just recently with cancer, and his wife has died after him with cancer. But I spent a lot of time, we went to a lot of properties, and I acquired quite a few mineral properties. A few I'd sold for some pretty good money. But I had one big sales I was working on with these oxides with a little bit of iron and a little bit of gold in them. And I had attracted some of the world top people. Crop industry from Japan had come over, and Nippon Steel Company from Japan. I mean, you could go on and on and on. I had Sovereign Resources came in with me, and sometimes I got contract. But the horrible part, I never could protect myself. I even took a lawyer in as a part-time partner one time, and that was even worse yet. He got the money first, and it never come down to us. But I did the work and maintained the claims and kept them all this time. And I had a deal one time to sell it. The Arcota claims were being sold to the Japanese for $750 million, and they put the money up front. So I took a check for $750 million to a bank, and I was trying to get it released, and there was some conditions on it that they had to be able to get the ports to ship the ore, and they were working on all that. Well, they couldn't get the ports to treat the iron anything other than a pollutant. And so I tried to get, I got some of the big major companies come in, Dravo and Dresser, and some of the big companies, and figured out a pipeline to Mexico. And we'd take and put the stuff in a slurry and ship it down there and ship it out of a Mexican port. We were very close on it. But what happened, DeConcini was a senator, and the Udalls, they were congressmen. One became a Department of the Interior. They wanted to be partners, and they let you know they could be partners. So if you wanted to hold the claims, you had partners. Well, if you take and divide 50% up to a congressman, 50% up to a senator, there's not a hell of a lot left. So I kind of killed the deal, but it made big headlines. There's pictures of some of the front pages on there on the table. If you want to pick one of them on the table in there, it says $750 million was visioned by Arcota. It's on the kitchen table there. So I'll just tell you that these things were real. And I dealt with a lot of big companies, and gold, that black iron up there has an ounce of gold in every ton of it. and it's a little hard to get out. It's almost like the clay in Georgia. But you can get it out, and it's, but remember, gold was illegal to have. And if you took the gold out, you were subject to prison, and they would take the gold. So, and there wasn't anything you could do with it. And these major companies, Dow Chemical Company, come out and looked it over. They sent a man named Stanton Layton out here, who was their head geologist. And Layton went over for years and years, studied the iron up there several years. U.S. Steel sent a man out called M.M. Sunders. He was their head geologist. And Germany, the Krupp industry, sent a man out named Humber, Dr. Humberg. And all these people thought it was a great deal, but they weren't sure about Arizona. They weren't sure about the tax structure. They didn't feel, I'll show you where it's at later. It's on the table over. It's one of them big white deals. It's blown up. It says Arcota. Anyway, we went on, and I decided I was going to, met a man named, no, that's a buffalo. It's one that says iron on it. We did a lot of work on that. I got a job with Coca-Cola Bottling Company, Mr. Martin, and they paid me $22 a week, which was a lot of money in those days. And that was a 6-day week. And I worked for him. He had all the distributorships for the butcher paper. He had all the gold, and we started working a little bit around a lot of the places where the early Spaniards had worked, and I found most of the gold that I found in places where they had raspas, where they had a donkey that had drug a stone around and knocked the stuff out, and they would take mercury and put it in the raspas, and the gold would go to the mercury and it would become very gummy, and then they would do it over and over again. Well, in Arizona, as hot as it is, the donkeys wouldn't last very long. At 85 degrees, mercury will solivate and goes into the air as a gas, and it'll kill anything. People around it really, really suffer like hell. They have big sores that come on them, and they lose their eyes. Their eyesight goes. They go blind, and their hair falls out, and their teeth falls out, and they don't last long after that. They usually die. So mercury is not the way to go, and cyanide's not much better either. Arizona's got this heat, and this heat it catalytically turns this stuff loose. So we worked a little bit of gold, but the gold wasn't that much. You'd get it out, and if you got to $22, $23, you could sell it to a jeweler, like I was doing down there. Or occasionally you could sell a little bit once in a while to some people that was leaving the country. Was going into Canada or a lot of Canadians come down here. So I met a lot of Mountie people and other people that would take the gold and go to Canada. Later I got hooked up with a fellow named De Gracia. De Gracia was a pretty well-known painter later part of his life, but when he was young, he would paint paintings, go down to Steinfels, and he couldn't even get the money out of the paintings for the paint and the fibers. He had a big U-shaped entry in there, and he'd sit down there in the coal and sell paintings. But then he started casting little figures out of clay, and then he got into wax casting, and I would sell him gold, and he would put it into various different little castings and stuff, and would sell the gold as castings. And he'd make a few crosses and a few things like that, and it was just very hard to get rid of gold, very hard. You mentioned Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher had some bad times when he was first working before he ever found the Teosha or the rest of him. He was really starving. And he'd come out and visited me many times, and he'd come out and he said, "Joe," he said, "I'd like to get a few ounces of gold from you." And I'd always said to him, he said, "I'd really for you to melt it down into little pigs if you could, or melt it into blank coins or that, or if you want to stamp it with a stamp." And he said, "Here's some of the things I'd like to have on them." And what he was doing was taking these back and showing them as seed money to raise money on that. As a matter of fact, when he found the Teosha, I got one of the first coins off of it. As a matter of fact, I got 7 of them. I got one for all my kids. And this is on my neck. I think it's on my neck. I haven't lost it. I've had it here almost all my life, ever since he gave it to me. If you'd like to, I told this to an old state senator. I told him that I knew Fisher pretty well, and he said, "Would you write me a letter of introduction to him?" The other side is a little different. Anyway, he said, yeah. So I wrote him a letter, and old Dr. Justin went down to Florida, and Fisher took him out and let him film all that. And as a matter of fact, the film that he done was very poor, but it was the first release of all the coins and stuff that they were bringing up off of it. Now he lives on the way down. We can stop in and see him, and possibly even get a copy of that tape that he did with Fisher. And he did a little short deal on me one time about some of the DeGracia. DeGracia buried some of the gold thing that he cast and some of the paintings and so forth. And he was trying to build up a legend for stuff that was hidden. And he did a little tape on that one time. And hell, he sold it to a major film company for a treasure deal that was shown on them. But anyway, we'll stop by and talk to him about that if you want to, on the way. He's right down the way. And Justin, I went back to and had a very good deal. And just before Fisher died, I went back, and there was a group of people from England come over here, and they were doing some things on zero energy. They were trying to put some things together, and they heard about me through Tesla. They flew me and my wife back to Florida, and they took me through all their plant, what they were doing, where they were working from England, and my wife had a real good time. She ate in the restaurants over there, and that we went out in the park with the squirrels, and the squirrels were educated squirrels down there. They'd throw nuts at you to make you drop your food if you were there. They had pretty well down to a science. But anyway, I spent a lot of time with Fisher when I was down there, and he gave me a few coins, and we had to talk about the good old times and some of the things, and he told me about his son. He lost his son, and his son-in-law, his wife, the boat turned upside down, drowned him. And he said, Joe, if I could correct that, if I could get it back, I'd give everything I've ever found for it. But we sat and talked a lot about the hardships and the legal things that he had. He'd go on for hours on all the legal problems he had. And he told me the story about Tucker. Did you ever hear the story about Tucker found all the gold? A bunch of gold. And he had lawsuits after lawsuits after lawsuits. He had some big chains and so forth. And so Tucker went and got it out of the bank. He had won one time, but they had appealed it. They had a whole bunch of other lawyers coming at him. So he took it home, and he took some yellow jello and made some molds and molded all these little coins out of the jello, and he kept it cold. He had to take dry ice to keep them cold. And he took a boat and went out to the ocean, dumped all this jello that was frozen solid on the deck of the dell, and he got a shovel and shoveled it overboard and threw it in the ocean. He said, there it is. He said, I found it, I give it back. Now you guys can go get it all you want to, just go look. And he pieced it out later, piecemeal at a time, but Tucker beat him, and old Fisher thought that was really bright the way he did that, because he said, that would have saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars if I'd have done the same thing. Einstein didn't care much for kids. He had a little world of his own. He was off on something, and it was hard to even talk to him. You'd almost think he was mentally retarded or something, because he didn't respond to people to even talk to him. I went out to his house one time. I took some pictures of his house out there, and he knew Wilhelm Reich real well. Now this is in 1954, 53, and Wilhelm Reich came out here for the purpose of studying why people didn't die that came to Arizona. And he thought Oregon was affected to it, and he was right. He was absolutely right. He wanted to know about these sanatoriums that worked and how they did. We visited them. And he built a few Oregon boxes out here. One of them's out here on the ranch. Anyway, he did a lot of things, and I got in a little trouble with him. He was working with these Oregon boxes, and this was long before Master and Robinson or anybody done anything on sex. And they call these boxes, they had multiple layers of iron oxide in them. The later ones iron oxide. Before that he used just rusty steel wool. And as long as it would rust. And any of the iron that would go in them would rust. You couldn't do it with galvanized, you had to do it with rust. And he'd build them in layers. He'd voltaire them. He'd put piles of them, put one piece of the iron oxide and one piece of a newspaper, cellulose fiber, another layer, another layer, another layer. He could put blankets of Oregon. You could put a piece of wool in between them, and then put the rusty screen wool in between them. He had to make them in layers. He called it voltairing. He called it a voltaire pile. Anyway, that energy would give off an energy that would actually, you could actually measure it with a temperature gauge. That in those boxes it would increase in the temperature. And there was no air, no flow or nothing to it. There was no real reason for it gaining heat inside an area, but it would gain heat. And so he said orgone did have it did give off a heat. And he was very active with that. With it, he experimented a lot with these orgone blankets and orgone boxes and treated cancer. He got into real trouble when he wrote the book, The Pathology of Cancer. It was that one that brought down the FDA on him, and they arrested him for making orgone boxes or making claims on orgone boxes. And one of his aides shipped some iron oxide and a couple of blankets across the state line, and they said that they had a federal restraining order on him not to talk about orgone or that, and they ordered all of his books burnt, and they arrested him. They took him to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I got a couple letters from him when he was back there, but they took him to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and he died in that place back there. I later went to a lot of trouble to find some of the people that was with him in prison. I found one of the guys that was in the cell next to him named Joe Matuso. Joe Matuso got thrown in there for lying to Congress about Joseph McCarthy. Now, it didn't make any difference that his lies is what convicted him and got McCarthy brought down, but they put him in prison for that. He come out here and he was kind of a little huster and shyster and all that, and he was real friendly with the ladies and that. And a lot of old widows, he took them for a few dollars. Even though you tell the women not to let him have $1, he would get down. He was a Jew, and he'd get down on their knees and pray with them, and he'd pray like he was a Christian and end up with their pocketbook. But Joe Matuso was not a very good man, and he had a little Chihuahua dog that he carried around with him and had him in his shirt pocket. And these old women just loved the hell out of him. He got some of them for several $1,000s, and you'd be warning him, telling him that he was no good. But he was the one that told me the last part of Wilhelm Reich. He really believed that they killed him. He said that he was subject to release anyway, and they didn't want him out there. And he was doing things with cancer that people just couldn't. They couldn't stand it. They couldn't have something, a cure for cancer that didn't cost anything. That couldn't be patented. And there's a lot of people living off of cancer. It's a big business, and that's why you can't say the word cure. And he built these cloudbusters a little different. I've read a lot about what is in the books. And there's a woman that's in charge of the Wilhelm Reich Institute in Wrangell, Maine. Her name is Mary. Mary, I'm getting slow on my whole name for the last time. But anyway, Mary, I'll think of her name in a minute. But Mary, I think she's kind of in love with his ghost. She's still trying to take. Now, he's been dead 50 years this summer. And half of his papers were supposed to have been released, the biggest half, after he was dead 50 years. He thought the rest of the world would catch up to the point where they could appreciate his cures for the diseases. And I haven't seen any releases on it yet. I haven't seen anything. Mary Higgins, I sent Lance Durant and his wife up there, and they tried to talk to her about getting some of these papers released, and she would meet with them if she wanted to pay them $150 an hour or something and talk about it. I didn't know if she had anything much to release or not. He did a lot of the stuff on space programs right here. He did the Cloudbusters, and it attracted a lot of people, big people. People that was the head of NORAD. It was General Groves come down here. There was Ambassador of Great Britain. He had the head of Southern Arizona Bank, Mr. Lewis. These were big people. They were not little people. And Kefauver came here. He was a senator from Tennessee, I think it was. And they all met and talked to him and talked about what he was doing and what he was doing. And these rainmaking experiments got a lot of interest. At the University of Arizona, about 12 cases. I mean, good-sized filing cabinets. That's in the bottom, special collections. I don't think anybody's ever gotten into them. I told a guy that was from California, had a little paper called Borderland, and he run a little paper, and he tried to get into those cases over there in California, and he wrote a couple of papers in a magazine about them over there. But he did a lot of research on the people. A lot of people was alive at that time that knew Wilhelm Reich, and they all had a chance. They got to spend time with him. And another man that I met in the 40s was an unusual man. He was a professor from Edinburgh College, and he was looking for gold. And he was the first man. He wrote a paper for the University of Colorado School of Mines, and the biggest part of it got in a Cornet magazine in 1936, I guess it was. Anyway, I've got a copy of that if you'd like to get a copy of it on him. And he's a very interesting man. I met him when I found out that he was recovering Kendall. Kendall was a professor from Edinburgh College, and he was out here looking at gold, and he had a place in Mexico called Artemisa. And he came to Tucson, and he met a school teacher about half his age. He was about 80, she must have been 50. Anyway, he may have had some help, I don't know. He had 2 boys by her. And he spent a lot of time here, and he went into Artemisa and opened up an old mine down there, and one of the Spaniards had worked on even. And he started taking gold out. I took a lot of gold out in Mexico. He was doing real well with it. He was taking gold out you couldn't even see. And he was using what amounts to a zeolite, kitty litter, as a trap. He was running the stuff through this kitty litter, and he was taking the kitty litter and refining the kitty litter and get gold. And he had acquired about a ton of gold, and he had a Dodge Power Wagon. And he loaded that ton of gold up and tried to bring it through at Douglas, and they arrested him. And they took the gold away from him, and he had a ton of gold. Now that was only about $400,000 when gold was $22 an ounce. So gold is only 10 ounces to a pound. And he had about $400,000 worth of gold at that time. So they arrested him. They took him and found him guilty. He was guilty. He had the gold, and that's all it took. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt put the Gold Act together, it was illegal for an American to own gold. You couldn't own a gold mine. Well, anyway, they brought him through the line, and they arrested him and found out about it. And I had visited him one time down in Mexico. I was trying to figure out how he was taking the gold out of the ore down there, and that's how I found out about the kitty litter that he was using for the trap. And I think he was doing some things with lye, too, because I seen sodium hydroxide down there. But then they could have been making soap for it. I don't know, it wasn't that much, it was just a big canister. But anyway, he didn't tell me everything he was doing, but when he got in prison, they had a prison on Mount Lemmon up here. As a matter of fact, they called that Camp Road. It went to Prison Camp Road. And in World War I, they put all the conscientious objectors up here on Mount Lemmon at a federal camp up there. Later, they turned it into a federal prison minimum security prison. He was in that. I did everything I could get to get him out. And because of his advanced age, I got a couple of federal judges to listen to me just a little bit. And I hired the firm of Cusick, Watkins, and Fry. Fry later become the head federal judge in this county here. And so he managed to get him paroled to me as long as I would pay the government $4,800 a year for supervising his parole. So my wife set up a set of books, paid him the $4,800, and we took, out of the $4,800, we took his Social Security out first. I could do that to him. And I helped build up his only Social Security, so he worked with me for 20 quarters. And we did everything you could think of on the gold. He wrote a book with a Dr. Schramm at the University of Colorado School of Mines. And it was on how to recover ionic, and it was one of the first books I ever saw on that. I had a copy of the book, but it burned up on a cabin on Mount Lemmon last year, 2 years ago. Anyway, I would like to get another copy of Kendall's book with Dr. Schramm on ionic gold. A lot of the plates in that would have been hand-colored, so I don't think it'll be a widespread book. But it did explain, and I understand that that's how all the big gold properties up in Carlings and all that place up there that are mining real fine gold, they use that as the Bible, the guidelines to go on it. Anyway, he was one of the few people that I met that knew that soap water, you could take soapy water and you could separate gold that was called clay, and you could get it in the foam. And he was real sharp on all ionic and colloidal gold. And Kendall was a very brilliant man. He maintained it down the road. Man would use this ionic gold and colloidal gold to accelerate plant growth. And the plants that the people eat off of it would find that it had curative powers, and it was beyond belief. And he called it Methuselah gold. He said that people would live maybe twice as long normally by eating the gold in this water, the golden water he called it. He could take it out at that time and concentrate the gold out of water, but it cost too much money at that time. He was trapping the gold out of the water, and he said it was a different form of deuterium. He said there's a form of deuterium, it's in the sulfide studs, it's very detrimental. The other side is very healthy. And he said the heavy weight. He said at that time, in the 40s, it would cost about $6,000 to refine this gold, to get any quantities of it out of the deal. And when gold was $22 an ounce, it wasn't practical. But now it's getting up there where it's at. And I think all the people you talked to about Champion and Hudson and all these other people that have experimented with gold, all of them have had copies of Kendall's little article in that paper. But Kendall worked with me for the 5 full years, and he spent a lot of time with my kids. He watered my trees. He done everything else, not just a lab. We didn't have a decent lab for him, and he did some experiments that still work. And while he was in prison up there, they got to him with the Mormons, and they made a Christian out of him, made a Mormon out of him. And after he got 20 quarters in with me, he got Social Security the rest of his life. So when his first Social Security check, he took a house trailer. I had a pretty nice Airstream, and I had a 4-wheel drive Jeep. And he took the Jeep and hooked on that, and that's part of the pay I gave him. And he left and went to Salt Lake City, and shortly after that he died. When I was quite young out here, I spent a lot of time at the airport. I was always interested in airplanes, and Hudson and 2 or 3 other people out here. And I'd go out there when I was a kid if I had any spare time at all, which I didn't usually have much. I'd go out and clean up the airport around I sweep all the stuff out of the hangars and clean all the grease off the planes and all that stuff. And they taught me how to fly and other things I didn't have to pay for, but I learned a lot from them. And in the process, I met a lot of people. Mr. Smith was working at the airport. Matter of fact, I got a good job through Edward O. Earl, who was on the airport board, and I finally quit working for Coca-Cola Bottling Company, which didn't pay anything, and went to work for Senator Construction, which Mr. Earl owned. And in the process, I got to meet a lot more people all over. I always worked my way into covering up dirt or hiding something that wouldn't pass or something, and I was pretty valuable to the company. And I could have things pass. It was substandard, and I would save a lot of time and a lot of money sometimes for the companies. But anyway, I was pretty gifted, and I kept my mouth shut until I got to be an old man, and I got to meet a lot of the people in that. But Mr. Earl was at the airport. I met a lot of the people at the airport. And then one of the people that I met there was Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes come into town, bought 50 square miles of land, and then he built the Hughes aircraft missile plant out here in Tucson, and donated to the Air Force, and then rented it for $1 a year from then on, eliminated all the county taxes or state taxes. So it belonged to the federal government after that. But Hughes was always ahead of them, and he bought a bunch of land. He bought a bunch of municipal bonds. And what land he bought that he had to pay taxes on, he would take the money off the municipal bonds and pay for them. And if there was an understanding, if they ever raised the taxes on any of his land that exceeded the municipal bonds, he'd dump all the municipal bonds. So the mayor and council, and board of supervisors, and the rest of them knew that they were dealing with a man that had a little more brains than they had. But I met him, and I got pretty friendly to him. We got to talking about little odds and ends, and I was asking him about him. He one time asked me, he said, what are you interested in me for? I said, well, you're a very successful man. And I said, when I was a kid, I was interested in Lipton, the man that come up with tea. I read everything I could read about him, and I read about all the people that built little empires like Baker Chocolate and all these people. I said, I just looked them up. I was interested in how these people had made their money and how they struggled. And I said, it wasn't always easy for you. He said, okay. He said, tell me about me. And so I sat down and talked to him, and I said, well, you were showing promise. You had a lot of money. You could do whatever you wanted to do, and you were kind of spoiled, I guess. He laughed on it, and then he said, well, what else? And I said, well, when you were real young, you had an uncle who taught voice. He was an opera singer, and he taught these movie actors, particularly the ones that were coming into talkies, how to talk and how to that. And he said, yeah. He said, that was my uncle. And he was going on talking about it. And I said, and through him, I said, I guess he was kind of a high-class pimp. He lined you up with a lot of beautiful women. He had cracked up. He really cracked up. He said, I did have a stable of beautiful women. And I said, I never could understand how somebody hadn't wrote a book about you, about what a lover you were, or a poor lover, or a bad lover. He laughed like hell, and he said, I usually sign them to a contract. And so I left them with a little bit of money, and they're not supposed to do any of that thing unless they meet my lawyer. But we talked about a lot of things. And I said, one time you had a woman in a car with you, and a young girl, and you were driving down Hollywood and Vine or someplace over there real close, and said some drunk fell out between the car and you run over him. Yep, so they killed him. And I said, you handled it pretty well. He said, tell me how I handled it pretty well. And I said, you flagged down a bus that was going by and put the girl on the bus to get away from it. You stayed right there until the police come, told them who you were, and I said after they filled out the paperwork on it, you told them there was another lady that was a witness to what happened, that the man just stepped out between the car and there was no way in the world he could have hit him. I said, and he went to all kinds of deal. Newspaper had a big write-up about a wealthy millionaire that had killed a poor man in California. And he was laughing at it. And he said, he said, well, then what? And I said, well, you went to the inquest. And I said, they knew there was another witness. She never revealed her name or anything. And said she come in, big hat, walked into the room, identified herself, got on the stand, and give the testimony, and all was taken down. She gave him an address and left. It was all over. She was gone. And they went to looking for her, put the press and all the rest of people, and it was a vacant lot, the address was. I said, she just disappeared. Nobody ever knew where she was. I said they found it was unavoidable, and I said that old drunk that she ran over must have had more relatives than anybody in California, because they come out of the woodwork. All of these people who was trying to sue you and all this other stuff. But I said, she cut it loose and it was all over. And he sat there and shook his head for a few minutes, and he said, well, you told me one. I said, well, you tell me one now. I said, well, it's something that he said, well, Joe, one time I went into an airport. And he said, I literally owned the airport. I owned all the TWA lines that were going in at that time. They were going after me big time, going to take everything away from me. And said, some of these penny pinchers that was working for me tried to make me more money, as though I really needed it. And said they put a dime machine on the toilet to take a crap. He said you had to have a dime. And he said, here, I never carry any money. I never carry any money. He said, I had to go to the bathroom, and he said, I'm 6+, you know that, inside. And said, I had to crawl under that damn deal. He said, I had a mechanic go in and knock all those damn things off before I left town, off the dime. He said, we took the dime thing off. I laughed at that one pretty good. He told me a few other little things about him and so forth. And I'd made a control tower that I had taken out at the airport after war. They had a control tower that was sitting up on about 60 foot of oak. Couldn't get steel during the war, and they took the control tower down, and they put a brand new tower in, and I could take it down. And Mr. Smith was running the airport. He said, Joe, you want that tower? And I said, yeah. He said, just get it off of here. And he didn't give me any deadline on getting it off, and all this oak timber went up 65, 70 foot in the air. So I went up with a railroad jack and jacked the thing up on the side, but I put a chain on the other side so it wouldn't fall off. And I'd saw 6 inches off, and I'd drop it down on that and chain it down on that one, and I'd go on the other side and drop it off. So it came down very slow. And we'd work full time, 7 days a week on it, but we would I got a lot of good old firewood out of that. I lasted me 5, 6 years. But it nearly drove Mr. Smith crazy because they cut all the lines to it, so they had to put temporary lights up there. So when I got done, I had probably 2 truckloads of batteries at the bottom that they'd throw it away every day. They'd go up there and put these lights in there and make them flash overnight. Next day, they'd replace them again the next night. But I finally got the tower down, moved it down on Benson Highway, put it in front of the restaurant and in front of the swimming pool, and I dug a hole out and put it in the steel. It had a lot of steel on the top of it, and set it down in the steel for, good 2 foot or 3 foot in the ground. It was really locked in and had these brown precision glass windows all the way around it. And then I built a room on the back of it, put my mother a little kitchen out there, and put 2 bathrooms back in the back. And we had the Gold Pan restaurant, I called it. Anyway, Howard Hughes would come in town, and he knew that was my mother's place, and he'd come in. He'd have a couple of people drive him over. They'd come over, and the guy would usually come in before and say, "Grandma, you look real tired. Aren't you about ready to close up?" She'd say, "Yeah." She knew he would. And they always left her a big tip. And so she'd close the place up, and shortly after that, Hughes would come in. Hughes would come in and sit down, and I knew there was something bad with Tucson water when Hughes wouldn't drink Tucson water. He'd always bring in a half a case of Pollard water from Pollard, Maine, little green bottles. And he'd take the lid off of one of them, and he'd take Kleenex and clean the top off of it. And my mother would fix him these greasy hamburgers, big, huge hamburgers. And he would take 4 or 5 of those, and he'd eat a hamburger, and he'd sit there for the longest time and talk. And when he'd come in, I wouldn't have any notice, so I put a bell between that place and which about 200 yards away was for the swimming pool and all the rest of them. I put her up there to feed my kids and my grandkids, all the kids. They had a restaurant to feed them, and that way they got fed decent meals. And Hughes would come in and eat there with them, and he'd have a bunch of people come in, and these people would come in and visit him. And they'd come in 1 or 2 at a time, and they would have papers to sign, and they'd sign the papers and all the stuff. He'd have a lawyer come in. Mr. Ed Morgan, later a judge, would handle a lot of the paper, and Harold Ashton, had a big Ashton construction company, would acquire the land for him. Harold Ashton would come over, and they would set things up. There was 2 people that he really liked real well. And he had a guy that was head of the aircraft union. After World War II, there was so many pilots that pilots would work for nothing. And they were all aircraft pilots would get on the planes and that. So hell, janitors got paid as much as aircraft pilots because there was so many of them. And so he helped form a union. He had a man named Chancey Logan. Logan come in and set up the aircraft, the union. And they tried to get him decent, at least minimum wage. Because these guys would fly for nothing, just to fly. They wanted to fly. And Hughes he got the choice of the ones he wanted. He had TWA, and they classified him as a monopoly. He had seen that the aircraft was going to be jets. Jets would be the future. And he had all the jets that was coming off of the airlines, Boeing and the rest of them, making airplanes. And he had the jets before any other airplane had jets. And because he had the monopoly, they finally took him to congressional hearings and everything else and took it away from him. And he said Anti-Sherman Act and the antitrust laws and all this other stuff. So they took the airline away from him, and they stripped him down to practically nothing. And after that, he formed a group of guys called the Delaney Group. Did you ever hear of them?
No.
The Delaney Group was the first CIA. And he filed Wild Bill somebody or another. Donovan. He had him help set it up. And he wanted dirt on every congressman, every senator, and everybody that could ever have a regulatory commission over him and that. And so that's the Delaney Group became the first CIA. And then along come the wars, and when the wars come along, they needed the CIA. So he contacted them out, and he would contact. But he had enough dirt on every congressman and every senator that he could just about bury them, any of them. He found out who was queers, who was child molesters, who was everything you could think of. He really put together a real deal. I met 2 people that worked for him later. One was a fellow named Murphy, and the other one was named Kelly. Ironically, here we are at St. Patrick's Day. But these 2 guys came out of Georgetown University back there, and they picked out the bright ones, and they would pick out the real sharp ones and train them in espionage. And actually, the Delaney Group set both of our whole military. It was his idea, his concept of having something. He never wanted to be embarrassed by a bunch of congressmen or senators. He didn't want to go. He called it the Baxter thing. He never wanted to go through another Baxter deal. He never wanted to have to put up with one of them son of a bitches that could make him sweat a little. Anyway, we talked a lot about. He hired Buckmaster Fuller. Buckmaster Fuller used to retire, come here in the summertime, in the wintertime. We talked about Frank Lloyd Wright, talked about Art Brown, and talked about Buckmaster Fuller. And he wanted Buckmaster Fuller to build a dome over the Spruce Goose, which Buckmaster Fuller did. So when they built that, and they put it over the top of the deal in Long Beach, and now it's the Long Beach Community Center, but they've taken the Spruce Goose up to Washington State. But when they first put it together there, Hughes asked me if I wanted to go over and visit the thing before it opened that. But then there was one of the presidents at that time wanted to visit it too. So all the people was there. They made them all leave the place on that. Buckmaster Fuller and Hughes and me and two other people that was his people who was real close to him got to stay, and they had the president go through the place and look through the plane and set the seats and all the rest of the stuff, all that. But and then after that it was open to the public, and I was over there, and he come down sick. Buckmaster Fuller come down sick right after that, and just a few weeks later he died. But Buckmaster used to come to Tucson, and he visited a man named Butler, who was an architect at ASU. And they used to talk and sit around, and he would take some of the bright kids by invitation, and they would all sit down in a room like this all around him, and he'd get on a stool, and he'd talk all day and all night if he wanted him to, and the next day he'd be still going the next day. And Fuller was really, really, really a bright man. And so he, Henry J. Kaiser liked the idea of what they were doing over there. And Kaiser had a lot of steel mills and stuff over at Eagle Mountain. And I went over and got a few magnetic wheels and a few things from Kaiser, and got to meet Kaiser. I worked my way. Kaiser was a hard one to meet. I walked into Kaiser's office, and his secretary said, "Who are you?" And I said, "My name's Blankenship." And he said he's busy. He doesn't see anybody. He doesn't see anybody without an appointment. And I said, "Well, do one thing for me." I said, "Tell him you've got a man out here that wants to see him for 1 minute. Not 1 minute more, just 1 minute." And so she went in and come back, and she said, 1 minute. So you got 1 minute. So I walked in the door, stuck my head in, and looked at him. He was sitting behind the desk, big, happy-faced man, looking at me. 1 minute. And I said, "Thank you, Mr. Kaiser. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you." And I walked out and shut the door behind me. And I got to the elevator. Here was Mr. Kaiser saying, "For what? For what?" And I said, "If it hadn't have been you building boats faster than they could sink them, we'd have probably a Nazi flag over California right now." He shook his head for a minute. "Come on back in." I went back in, and I stayed there that day, and he invited me back up the next day. I had my wheel. I got a free wheel out of the Eagle Mountain. The next day he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I got a guy that drove me over," and I said, "He can stay in a hotel or what?" I said, what do you want to go look at?" And he said, "I got Bucky Fuller." He said, "You knew him." He said, "He built me a geodesic dome in Hawaii." And he said, it's going to be an auditorium. And he said, "They're cutting the ribbon tomorrow morning." And he says, "I'm going to go over if you'd like to go." And so I'll take you over and bring you back. He said, "I've got just that much time going over for the ribbon cutting." So I went with him, and we got to talk, and he had a pretty well insulated plane. You could talk in the back, you could sit around and talk, and we talked about Hughes and talked about other things and talked about this and that and so forth. I told him what happened to Eagle Mountain up there, and I said, "What are they going to do? Are they going to stop iron?" He said, "The pollution control is going to take over the steel mills in Montana." He says, "I'll never be able to run anything over there." He said, "The Eco-Nuts are going to run that," and he said, "We'll be buying steel from Germany or Japan until they take over this country." And he was really telling you the way it was. He said, we can't build any more steel in this country to make any more of that and so forth. And I talked a lot about his cars. He went into the car business, and they busted him out. I had two of his cars. I got it out here now. I got a Henry J. Kaiser, and I got a Kaiser. I got a Henry J. and a Kaiser. And they're old rusted up cars, but to me they have value. Anyway, he told me about what they'd done in the car business. He thought he'd have an edge. In fact, he could make his own steel, and he thought he could buck the cartel, and he could pull it off and that. But the environmental controls and all the other stuff, and he was the first one to have disc brakes and a whole bunch of other stuff. He took a lot of stuff off of Tucker was Tucker car. He took a lot of the stuff off of him and put it incorporated in his cars. And he was real proud of his cars. He was hoping that he would be like Ford or some of the others for the rest of his life. Didn't work out. They busted him out. They cut the price of the cars down to a point where they were selling for cheaper than what they had until they ran him out of business. And they spread a lot of bad rumors and everything. But he was glad to talk to me about it. And I was really glad to listen to him. I should write all of that down. I did write most of it down. I got it in notes. It's still fresh on my mind. But we went over we got over there an hour late. He bucked a headwind. And they'd already cut the ribbon and opened up the field, so they had to re-ribbon it again, and then they cut it again. He went in. It was a well-built building. It solved a lot of the problems with the geodesic domes. They'd come up with some silicons that would withstand the weather, could go for expansion and contraction. And he built those. Fuller built those dew line fields up in Alaska to find when there were airplanes, the Russians were coming, or this or that. And he developed them up there. And he never made any money working for the government. Fuller got the idea to show people how to build a chicken coop or build a geodesic dome for the kids' playhouse. And so he set of plans up to put these triangles together into the hectagon and then bolt them all together. He went to Popular Mechanic magazine, and he charged $5 for a 3-set plan, just a 3-set mimeograph paper, mimeographed. And he charged $5 for that, and there was 3 cents postage at that time. And there was several million people sent for those plans. And so he became financially independent with those little tiny geodesic domes, showing people how to build them. I got 3 of them out here that I built with those plans, even after all these years. Anyway, I'm a pack rat. I just keep things, no matter how rusty, how bad they get. Anyway, I told Kaiser about that, and he laughed about it and so forth. And Kaiser had a way of picking up a phone and calling somebody, and somebody would call him back later and tell him, that's true, that's true. And Kaiser didn't have no bullshit around him at all. If anybody was trying to tell him something that wasn't really true and somebody didn't know, they were gone. They were history. And you had to be really careful about what you said to Kaiser, because he was checking on what you said, if it was real or not. But Kaiser was a very, very good man, and I took a bunch of pictures of the iron mine over there before they tore down the buildings, and now they made a prison camp out of it. And the only memorial over there is from the Japanese. The Japanese put a little plaque up there that if this man hadn't been alive, we'd have probably won the war. It's right there at Eagle Mountain.
That's good, right there.
I told him about the time he crashed a plane in California. And he said, yeah. He said, I remember it well. He said, I'll be crippled from it for the rest of my life. I said, when you hit the thing, it got away from you. And he said, yeah, the airons didn't work the way they should have. The cables would snare, and he said, and it took me down. He said, I hit the house. And I said, yeah. I said, and the way you did the fellow that drug you out of the plane. He said, tell me about that. I said, well, you asked him, as soon as he drug you out of the plane, how much money he made. And he was a little engineer, and I think it was something like $300 a month. And you told him, you'll have $300 a month the rest of my life. When I die, you no longer get the $300 a month. But as long as I'm alive, you'll get $300 a month. He laughed like hell over that. He laughed. He said, I didn't know many people even knew about that. And he said, where did you find out about this? And I said, I knew a man named Walt Roberts, who's a school teacher now, who took lessons from your uncle. He learned to be an opera singer, and he's got a hell of a voice. He said, when he sings Old Man River, he said, it can make tears come to your eyes. And I said, Walt Roberts was a real good guy, and he met an uncle of yours, and he said, that uncle gave me a lot of trouble. He said, he filed suit against me several times and tried to get some of that. He said, when my dad died, he said, I asked for 2 things. I asked for the patents on the portable drill head. And that's the main thing I wanted, was a patent on the multiple head drill. And he said, and to this day, he said, that's the biggest money maker I've got. Missiles and all the other things that I build, airplanes and all these other things. He said they're secondary. He went into details about how this country here, the Americans never really appreciated him in any way at all. The military wouldn't even talk to him. The Navy wouldn't even talk to him. So he was going to run a plane into Bendix. So he got a big Whitney Pratt & motor, a big 400 horsepower plane, and he stripped it down and took all the rivets out of it. And then he put them back in with an epoxy glue and screwed them in, and then ground the heads off of them. After he tightened them down as tight as he could and put Loctite on them, all that, then he took all the little rivets off of the airplane, every single one of them off. And he, of course, set a world record with that plane. The only people who were paying any attention to him was the Japanese. The Japanese done that to their Zeros, every one of the Zeros. And that nearly cost us the war, because they were so much superior to anything else. We finally muscled up with some of our planes, put so much power in them that we could overcome the maneuverability. These little Japanese could go all around us and shoot hell out of us and knock our planes down. They didn't even have any armor on them. And we come up with that Wildcat and a few others, and we finally worked our way back up, but it almost cost us World War II. And he was real proud of those planes that he built and the things that he put together. And he was real proud of the fact that he built the Spruce Goose. Now, the problem he had with the Spruce Goose was there wasn't any metal. He couldn't get any aluminum.
Right.
So he made it out of airplane, and he helped develop some of the best glues that we ever had. Without those glues, we couldn't have carried through on the war. That was a big, big plus. That was worth more than the airplane. And also, he did a lot on synchronizing the vibrations. He probably understood vibrations more than any other person in the world. Because when you take 8 motors like that in that size, and if they get out of sync, the plane is going to go down. So he had to do all this. And so with those, he went into the computer business. He had to computerize all this stuff on these planes. The things that he developed on the Spruce Goose give us the age to space. I mean, without that work, we wouldn't have had the synchronization of the vibration. We wouldn't have had none of the computerization that was started. After that, he opened the door for wind tunnels. He opened the door for computerization on all these things. And Howard Hughes was a genius. He was never recognized for all the things that he'd done for us. Without him, we'd never get started. What he cleaned up, he was a real bug about germs.
Right.
He wanted the guy to come in, open the door, put hydrogen peroxide around the seat where he's going to sit, and he would, most of all, he wanted the flies out of the cafeteria. He wanted to make damn sure there was absolutely no flies in there. So here, this fellow would go through the whole place with a fly swatter and kill all the flies. My mother had the place closed, and she'd put out the hamburger and the stuff. You know they're going to have a hamburger. He wasn't going to drink no water or anything. Then along I'll remember the guy's name in a minute. He used to come in, and he'd come in. One time he said, "Joe," he says, "a lot of times I come down here and there ain't no flies." He says, "and the old man doesn't think I'm doing my job if I don't have some dead flies in a box for him." He said, "Could you go around and kill me a few flies and have them in a little pill box with cotton?" And I said, "Sure, what the hell." So I killed him a few flies and had them for him. And next time he'd come in, and he looked around, he said, "There's not many flies around, Joe." I said, "Yeah." It's like, "You get a box for me?" "Yeah, I got a box for you." "Okay." I give them to him. So he'd put them over in his box, take them there. And I forget the guy's name, but Hughes looked at the flies, nodded his head. And he reached over and got the box, pulled it over in front of him, and he reached over on the table and got a toothpick and he turned them over. And he said, "Hal, don't try to ship me, those are stale flies." I cracked up, I really cracked up. I couldn't take it anymore.
Heard a funny thing. Somebody said to me, you know that I could be in love with almost everything.